Welcome back to my podcast, Grief the Real Talk. In this episode, I'm going to talk about the various stages of grief we grievers experience. Let us not get misconstrued by the often spoken about 5 stages of death. Originally written by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler in her book on death and dying. These 5 stages, denial, anger, bargaining, acceptance, depression, were originally written for the dying patient after receiving the bad news. But during the grieving process, there are more phases, and as any of us grievers know, there is no set stage, time, or how many repeats through the grief process cycle will endure each or any of these stages, repeatedly. I know for me, especially, guilt is definitely a big one as part of the grieving. And along with that, I will add shock and numbness. Today I want to dive into those 2 biggies, because from the research I've done around forums and specifically from my own journey through grief, these 2 other emotions we go through were the stage setters for my own grief. First, I'm going to talk about the initial stage of grief. As far as I'm concerned, the number 1 is shock and numbness. This is the beginning of our grief, and it isn't necessarily only what happens after we lose our lost loved one, inasmuch as it can occur before we've even lost them. Shock and numbness set in for me when I first received the bad news of my husband's diagnosis. Internally, I went numb in disbelief and refused to believe my husband was dying. I stayed numb through his dying days because I was living in internal shock and I could not allow myself to fall apart because my priority was taking care of my husband. And I would have been useless for him had I allowed myself to fall into the dark hole while caring for him. This internal mechanism we have to shut down is for the goodness of our own health. It's kind of like when a victim has been raped or assaulted and they black out what is happening in order to survive the trauma. Through shock and disbelief, I soldiered on caring for my husband while denying to myself that he was dying. Why? Because I could not even fathom my life without him. The numbness was a welcome tonic to my tortured soul. It held me together through his dying and lingered on past his death as denial set in. After I allowed myself the reality of his death setting in, the PTSD and triggers came along in the form of auto-replaying the whole scenario over and over in my head, from sickness to death. Numbness is an auto-shutdown of the reality of it all that our minds and bodies need to endure, kind of like when a patient is put into a medical coma to allow a body to heal without any movement or activity. I was in zombie mode going through the necessary motions, without thinking ahead to even the next few minutes. It's been 2 years since I lost my husband, and I can tell you, in my heart and soul, it feels like no time has passed as my grief still bubbles daily. All the stages of grief for me are interchangeable. Some days the anger boils up in me because his illness struck during COVID, and despite my pleas and telehealth calls, I couldn't get my husband admitted to hospital because of their protocols. One had to be bleeding to death or stroking out before they could even be permitted in an emergency hospital room during COVID shutdowns. My husband's cancer, eating away at him daily, couldn't get a spot in a hospital until it was too damn late. So yes, I'm angry, and I still can't swallow the whole horrible situation. My bargaining and denial days are done, though. They only prove to be fruitless. As for acceptance, yes, my husband is dead, but no, I still cannot accept it. But let me talk about another stage that doesn't seem to disappear either, and that's the guilt. Guilt is a terrible weight to have to carry. Nobody understands a mourner's guilt except the mourner himself. Now, I know I did everything I could in my power to try and save and help my husband. I know for all the days in our life together, I would always do anything I could do to move heaven and earth if I had to help my husband. I begged and pleaded with his doctors for help, and their hands were tied. Yet I carry the guilt that I couldn't save my husband. Yes, I know, I'm not God, and I did my best, and the powers were not in my hands. But despite all that, I can't seem to let go of the guilt. In this stage of guilt, we replay all the events that took place from dying to death and beat ourselves up for the bad things that happened when we know in our hearts that it wasn't our fault. But we take the blame anyway. This stage is a tough one to pass through, and even I am not there yet. But I wanted to share these two ugly stages that most of us will encounter when we lose the love of our lives, because they are very real. As I stated in some of my other podcasts, I have no MD attached to my name, but I am a griever and speak from the heart and life experience. I also do a lot of research on life, death, and dying, and the afterlife, and have read many books on these subjects, as well as currently writing one. I visit many forums on these topics too, and when I visit these forums, I am more interested in reading the comments from grievers than sometimes the article itself. We have much to learn from others who walk in the shoes of grief. And I would also like to add here that unbearable grief and the side effects it leaves us with will often require professional help to ease through the journey. It's a very tough journey to ride alone. So please, for those of you who are experiencing some of the terrible side effects of mental anguish, please look for some professional help or join a group of like-minded souls where you can at least feel comfortable around. We all need a support system to help us through the stages. Thank you for listening.